Gunfire Reborn is a game I've had my eyes on for quite some time. Namely because it's an FPS roguelike and, well, I fucking love first-person shooters. Being a roguelike with co-op is just the cherry on top, really. As I prefer to avoid early access whenever possible these days, I waited until its recent 1.0 release, and man, it was worth the wait. For a small Hong Kong-based studio of around 4 to 7 people, as far as I could find out, this is some serious quality. The best I can describe this game is, you know Borderlands? Yeah, it's that. Gunfire is one of those games that just makes its inspiration so very blatant that if you regularly play FPS games, you probably have a solid understanding of how a number of the systems and weapons in this game will work. And that's not to sound reductive, of course. While individual ideas are lifted wholesale in some cases, they use those ideas as a stepping stone to then expand on them or make them fit into a different framework. The biggest example is that this game uses the same health and damage types as Borderlands. You have 3 elements in this game: fire, electric, and corrosive, and they respond to the 3 health types: flesh, shield, and armor. The main difference is that in Gunfire, armor is an alternate shield type rather than a health type, so everything has flesh. But this is also where they make things a bit different, because they add a mechanic where you can inflict multiple status effects to combine them on an enemy. By hitting someone with fire and corrosive, you can make an explosion effect. Fire and electric causes enemies to attack each other, and electric and toxin causes enemies to take a percentage health damage that spreads to nearby enemies. So for the gameplay itself, the first thing you'll probably notice is that, holy shit, this game is kinda slow. At least for my standards. I generally prefer games with quick action where either your character is quite fast or agile like Shadow Warrior 2, the enemies are the ones who are fast like Serious Sam, or a mix of both like Doom Eternal. But in this game, both you and the enemies are quite slow, and while you do have a dash move, it too is pretty sluggish and is on a 3-second cooldown. However, I really didn't mind that. At first it really bothered me, but after about an hour or two, I got into the groove of this game and found that it was tuned pretty well for this speed. As comical as it looks, enemies will generally have a very hard time hitting you if you stay moving, and even more if you're pretty close to them. Even homing projectiles can be avoided easily with simple strafing. It just comes down to knowing how you should move and when you should utilize that dash, since it's not really a one-size-fits-all solution due to the cooldown. It took me a few hours of just sitting at range and peeking corners before I realized you can very well play a highly close-range playstyle if you're careful enough. Another thing that felt off is how often I would miss when I'm playing. I'm no paragon of godly aim, but for a game this slow, it felt weird. While there is a tiny amount of hitbox jank in places, a lot of it has to do with the fact that virtually every weapon in this game is a projectile, even if it doesn't seem like it, because it's usually a very fast projectile. Combine this with the fact that enemies don't stop fucking wave dashing with animations that snap around constantly, it can be a bit annoying to hit some enemies. Especially when one class is focused on using snipers and going for headshots. I got used to it, granted, but it still feels a little jank at times. Keep in mind that this is mostly apparent in the first stage and becomes significantly less noticeable after that. And that's sort of a recurring theme with this game. The further you go in, the quality just becomes exponentially better. The first stage is honestly kinda lame. It's just basic purple hallways with some decent lighting, and while it's alright to play in, it's just bland visually with all the enemies kinda looking a bit the same. Then you move to the second area, which is a huge jump in quality, with it having more open connectors between rooms, more enemy variety both visually and mechanically, and offers more variety in terms of layout. The third stage is easily the best, with a lot more variety in the terrain, more verticality in some rooms, and the enemies are just really creative. The boss, along with its intro, is just a massive step up from everything before it. As for the structure, it's just a standard roguelike. Your goal is to get to the final boss by going through numerous rooms across 4 stages that all end in their own boss fight, and you have to do this without dying. You can actually die once and come back, but it will cost you some XP that's used to level up and unlock some new characters. The boss battles themselves are all massive creatures that you have to fight, with some pretty enjoyable movesets and gimmicks. I was actually surprised by how much I liked nearly every boss battle in this game, considering FPS games tend to be pretty hit or miss when it comes to bosses. At worst, the boss is okay, and at best, these bosses can be really good. For the levels themselves, it consists of a bunch of handcrafted rooms that are strung together by connecting paths, which will lock you in once the encounter in said room starts. These rooms are generally pretty open, without a whole lot to explore, as you can usually see everything you might need to go out of your way for, just by doing a quick scan of the place. The only things you really need to keep an eye out on are special chests, which offer you bonuses at the cost of something, portals to a challenge room, which offer additional chests, and the NPC merchant and blacksmith. Everything either glows really bright or stands out very well, so it's kinda hard to miss them. Inside the challenge rooms, you'll usually end up fighting a boss, which is an elite version of an existing enemy, but props to the devs for not just making them a big version of that enemy. With the exception of the elites from the first stage, they generally have their own unique movesets that are separate from the enemy they're based off of. So when it comes to progression in this game, it's largely focused around how much you play. You have a whole passive tree that you can level up with Soul Essence, which you get passively during a run. You can get new weapons and buff items by killing a certain amount of certain enemies, so all you have to do is just keep playing the game and you'll unlock everything. The worst you have to do is kill a specific enemy with a specific damage type that they're likely already weak to anyways. Initially I was worried about the passive tree as well, since it would feel like you could just end up out-leveling the content instead of actively getting better at the game. But the stat upgrades bottom out pretty quickly, and the later boosts take a long time to fill out, so it didn't really bother me as much. And there's one thing about item unlocks that's handled really well in this game. When you unlock an item, the enemy that unlocked it will always drop said item, which gives you the opportunity to see how it works before you have to make any hard decisions later if you end up having to purchase it. Unlocks are also spaced out well enough that you can still find new stuff regularly even after playing for a while. Said weapons you unlock are also really cool too. This game leans more on the gimmick route more than anything. For some weapons, the gimmick could just be that it's a special weapon class, like a minigun or a double-barreled shotgun, but some of the other guns are pretty crazy. One moment you're using a black hole cannon that sucks enemies in before exploding, and the next you'll be using a crossbow that fires in sequence a 3-round burst, a stronger 2-round burst, and a massive exploding bolt. And outside of a few exceptions, I would say that the weapons are all pretty good. I'd sooner say that a weapon has mediocre numbers, or it doesn't really feel as good to use, rather than the gimmick itself getting in the way, or just isn't interesting. And the weapons feeling good is something I want to emphasize here, because the weapons overall do feel pretty good. They got some nice feedback and sounds to back up some of the crazy things they do. It also features a loot system where every gun has a variety of modifiers that mostly rely on being conditional or having some downside to them. Things like reloading much faster if you don't have anything in the magazine, or bonus damage against enemies hit by a special status, or even gaining a lot of magazine capacity at the cost of something else. Those are just the low-level modifiers. The modifiers function off a tier system, with green being the simplest and most common, blue being less common and better, or more unique, and orange being pretty rare and either being really good or doing something really weird while also being unique to the individual weapon. I haven't found many orange modifiers, but the one I did find was pretty sick. It made my sniper type weapon have only 2 shots in its magazine no matter what I did. The first shot had no special effect, and if I killed someone with it, it was refunded. But if it didn't kill something, the second shot had a 200% crit chance, meaning I did a devastating double crit. Now for the characters. There's currently 6 available, and they all offer their own set of stats, abilities, and passives that tie into their archetypes. Each character consists of a primary ability that runs off of a cooldown, and a secondary ability that relies on charges replenished by drops or consuming ammo if you unlock an early passive for it. And I'll apologize in advance for my pronunciation, because all but one of these are Chinese names, and I'm so white I practically generate my own light. First up is the starting character, the Crown Prince. He's the most versatile of the lot, as he doesn't really have any specialization other than elemental damage. And even if you have no elemental damage on you, your second ability always does elemental damage. Alternatively, you don't even have to spec into raw elemental bonuses and just boost your primary and secondary abilities whenever possible. His primary ability is an orb that has a small area of effect, which deals damage and freezes enemies for several seconds, while also slowing down bosses too. A very straightforward and very useful ability, especially for those annoying as hell shield enemies if you don't have any explosives on you, as it lets you get a much longer opening to deal damage. His secondary is a corrosive gas grenade that explodes when it hits the floor, and annoyingly, not when it hits an enemy. And enemies hit take damage over time, as well as a slow from the decay status. It's also really nice for rapidly triggering combined statuses, as it constantly applies the corrosive status. He's definitely the most straightforward character, but what he can do doesn't end there. Every chest you open has a chance of providing you with a chalice that lets you pick one of 3 perks to enhance one of 3 skill trees. One is usually focused around buffing the weapons they expect you to use, another is focused around your main ability, and the last is focused around your secondary ability. They do have quite a bit of crossover with one another, so even if you're focusing entirely on one tree, it can still be a good idea to pick something from another tree. With many of the perks, they have 3 levels, and the 3rd level is often some huge bonus that makes it very worthwhile to focus on and upgrade it whenever you can. In the case of the Crown Prince, yeah, he's still pretty straightforward. You can give his primary more charges, a longer freeze, more damage, or buff his weapons. His grenades can hold more charges, do more damage, and make enemies explode on death. And he has a variety of buffs that focus on killing enemies that are affected by status effects. The second character you'll unlock is Albai. He is definitely the most versatile because his primary ability lets you use pretty much anything, even if he does favor a few weapon classes more. He gets the ability to dual wield any weapon in the game, with the exception of a few unique weapons that require 2 hands, like swords and bows. His secondary is just a simple explosive grenade. But his perks are where he really goes off the rails. He focuses on defense alongside his dual wield skill, explosives in general, and having some buffs to his weapons. You can get health regen while dual wielding and killing enemies, increasing your max HP and even more so while dual wielding. You can get bonuses for having weapons that can heavily sustain their fire, and do all of this while regenerating ammo like a monster. His piece de resistance, in my eyes, is the level 3 dual wield duration perk. Not only does it double the duration you get, but you get duration back based on the amount of shots you fire. Let me tell you, dual wielding miniguns with this thing is an absolute nightmare. You will never not be dual wielding, and it's awesome. The next character you'll unlock, if you didn't decide to save up for the only hero who costs Soul Essence, is King Yan. He's unique in that he's the only class that does not have shields, but instead armor. Armor doesn't regenerate on its own, but his primary ability, which is a dive kick, will also restore a portion of your armor for every enemy you hit in its AoE. His second ability is a melee attack that hits everything in an AoE in front of him. And this is where I learned how aggressive you can be in this game, because this guy can really get in people's faces and tear shit up. His perks offer some of the strongest effects so far. You can reset your primary on every kill, allowing you to chain it together. You can make your secondary regenerate armor on every hit alongside your primary. You can make the secondary have more range and damage for every enemy that's nearby. You can get charges for the secondary back if you kill enemies with it, and all sorts of buffs that follow the use of your primary or secondary abilities. In essence, you become an absolute monster at ability spam and sustain while you're constantly regenerating your armor back, then spending it all to deal a shitload more damage, and then immediately getting it all back again. While it's hard to beat a Rottweiler dual-wielding rocket launchers, I had so much fun with the insane stuff you can pull off with this character. And after that, you're most likely going to unlock the character that you can purchase with Soul Essence, since the last one isn't unlocked for quite a few levels. Tao is a heavily restrictive character in terms of your arsenal, because nearly everything she does revolves around dealing as many hits as possible. More specifically, consuming ammo as fast as possible, so shotguns aren't exactly amazing on her, but they can still have their place. This is because your primary ability fires off a stream of swords at enemies, with the amount being dictated by how many stacks you build up. You build up stacks by consuming ammo. 15 ammo of any kind gives 1 stack, so more often than not you'll be using a metric shitload of normal ammo, since special ammo weapons are far too slow. Her secondary deals damage and marks anything it hit, and every 12 times you hit a marked enemy, they'll take an extra burst of damage. If you can mark an elite while using a high rate of fire weapon, or a shotgun while your ult is going off, you can throw out a lot of extra damage. Now you can still play this character with other weapons because there are perks that provide bonuses for just being at high stacks. But I found even with those perks, you're still better off using your primary, since high rate of fire weapons can get those stacks back really quickly. Her perks offer a ton of synergy between the 3 trees. They all have ways of triggering the swords from your primary to appear, which get buffs from the primary perks. Her gun-focused tree has a lot of defense and offensive buffs from using your primary or triggering it frequently, as well as ways of sustaining fire really well. And her secondary has a lot of further buffs that help you ramp up your burst damage and spread its effects much easier. For as limited as you are in terms of weapons, I still really enjoyed this character, mostly because it kinda makes the minigun one of the best weapons on her. The most recent character to be added is Kianswai. Like Tao, he's also purchased with Soul Essence. This guy is a melee tank who prefers to just block damage rather than sustain his own HP. His primary is a melee mode where you plot an indestructible barrier that blocks all frontal damage while forcing you to resort to punching, which is your secondary ability. It also buffs your dash to go twice as far and also deal damage. Once the duration ends, you perform one last bash attack. As I mentioned, the secondary is just a punch that hits anything in front of him, but it also has a feature where the faster your character moves, you gain stacks of fist sensation. Yeah, remember these guys are from Hong Kong, so while the English translation is pretty solid, there is some weird stuff from time to time. So each stack of fist sensation gives you more damage. His perks are entirely focused around defense and getting as much use out of your fist as possible, either on its own or with the primary ability. Things like more fisting capacity, punching enemies restores duration on your primary, or you can immediately get your primary back if you get a kill right when it ends, and even some move speed to help you build up your fist sensation. My favorite detail of his primary is that any blocked damage counts as taking a hit. You just take no damage from it, so you can trigger scrolls like damage reflection or health regen upon getting hit while risking nothing. And while he sounds really powerful, you really have to be able to manage your secondary ability. If you can't sustain it well enough, then you lose a lot of power. Your primary is still a great get out of jail free card on a short cooldown, and there's some good damage buffs related to using your primary, but you also can't attack other than punches during your primary, and you also have an entire tree that's dedicated to punching that you have to deal with. The last character is one you don't get for quite some time because it requires you to put 55 points into your passive tree. This is Lay Low, and despite his appearance, he's actually the marksman slash caster. His primary provides a buff where you have increased ability damage, allowing you to blast off your secondary for huge damage, and then have it finished off by landing a single powered up shot from your gun that strikes the enemy with a hit of lightning. Hitting an enemy with your gun instantly stops the ability, while using your secondary doesn't. His secondary is just a chain lightning, which does exactly what it sounds like it does. A little unlike most other characters, he gets the vast majority of his function from perks, as they offer some insane bonuses. He's very much a character for those who like leaving luck to decide their fate. One tree focuses on utilizing crit and lucky shots to kill enemies in one shot to provide a ton of bonuses, from immediately reusing your ult to triggering free uses of your secondary, which can be made to trigger the lightning strike from your primary and benefit from all three bonuses. The level of damage you can pump out with this guy so early on is kind of insane. When I beat the game on normal, my highest damage in a single shot was 22,000. I did almost double that before I even beat the first boss of stage 1. And that's fun and all, but I haven't gotten into the best part: occult scrolls and how everything ties back into itself. Occult scrolls are your expected roguelike items that provide various buffs, with maybe some downsides to them. Things you can expect, like hitting twice per hit at the cost of doing half damage, having damage reduction when you have shields, and taking more damage with no shields, or just having reduced cooldowns. You can already imagine how silly things can get really quick when you take into account the already powerful character perks. It's not just the characters and scrolls, the weapons themselves can also synergize extremely well with various combos of the previous two categories. All three modifier pools combine to allow some absolutely insane and fun builds. Here's two of my favorite examples. Albai's explosive tree allows you to really push explosives to their limits, namely flat AoE boosts and damage. I ended up getting a lot of explosive perks, so I decided to lean into it really heavy. I used a weapon that has an alt fire where you detach the chassis of the gun and throw it like an explosive. With the more max ammo, the more damage it does. This gun was given a huge magazine with base modifiers on top of the special inscription that combines both my weapon's magazines together. It also had a modifier where the more ammo I consumed from my magazine, the more crit chance I had, on top of having a metric shitload of crit to begin with. And to top it all off, every time I scored a crit, I had more crit damage until I landed a normal hit, which I rarely ever did. While I was blasting through ammo, since every throw costed 84 rounds, I have a scroll that made it so I never needed to stop. It regenerated a portion of my magazine every second for a few seconds, and this ammo came from thin air, and I only need one shot in my magazine to do full damage with the explosion. At that point, my damage was set to where I'd be dealing several 100,000 damage in a massive 10-meter AoE every throw. All I had to do was hope my defense got covered, which it did. I found a scroll which converted all of my shields into HP, and a scroll that gives more damage and a massive chunk of movement speed when I had no shields, which was always. Since Aobai has some percent health regen from killing enemies and using its primary, I had some pretty solid sustain when paired with my huge movement speed helping me not take damage. The next example of a crazy fun build I had revolved around Tao. She has high shield, so when I found a scroll that doubled my shield while moving all my HP, I took it pretty easily. This is also because she has a perk where every hit from your swords gives you some extra max HP, up to 8 per stack for up to 8 seconds. Because all of this was getting doubled, I would use my ability and get something like 600 shields, which is pretty insane considering your total base HP is just under 200. I was basically getting a full heal and then some every few seconds. I then found a scroll that made every kill start my shield regen, and with 600 max shields, that's a lot of effective healing. Since I had a minigun, I used a lot of ammo and got my stacks up very quickly, so I could spam the hell out of that primary ability. On top of that, I had a 20% damage reduction for 10 seconds when I used 100 ammo, which was pretty frequent. Now, that together is pretty insane as is, but the single most insane part of this build is that the minigun I had a single blue inscription, plus 0.2 projectiles per kill until reload. This means I would have a 20% chance to fire an additional projectile for every kill. Problem is, I reloaded a lot because minigun. Well, I got a fun little scroll that caused me to shoot from my reserves first rather than my magazine. This means I literally never had to reload, and by the time I hit the third boss, I was burning through ammo to spam my primary, getting really tanky, and firing 6 bullets per bullet from this massive minigun. And I won't lie, it still was mildly challenging. Not super hard, but I had to focus on a lot of synergies, and if I slipped up, I could still take some insane damage at the wrong time, since I had to rely on timed buffs and being able to trigger them to not instantly melt. I actually did die once near the end on the second run, but it was because I just got too cocky. But for every god tier run like that, there's plenty of pretty bad ones due to RNG or me fucking up before I can take it anywhere. I find this game to be decently challenging actually. A single enemy can take you out way faster than you might think at first, and you have limited sources of regen other than King Yan, one perk Aobai has, and a few scrolls, and even then, they only cover you for sustained periods of not getting hit, with the exception of King Yan. RNG is the biggest gripe I have in this game. The higher difficulties make it feel like you really need to have a crazy build started in order to get past the second area, or else you just have no chance at winning. This is made so much worse with the inclusion of the final boss. He's actually optional since you can just beat the stage 3 boss and end the run, or you can push to the 4th stage and fight the final boss. But what they do with him doesn't really feel satisfying, even if the excuse is that he's optional. The final boss is straight up a DPS check and nothing else. The boss himself is honestly not that hard. The only thing you really need to worry about is the bullet hell phase if you don't have enough move speed. Once you enter the boss arena, you're faced with a bar under his HP that gradually grows. At certain points, he'll become invincible and attach himself to a device that makes the bar go up even faster unless you can destroy it. Once the bar is full, you enter the final phase where you just have to do enough damage in 15 seconds or you lose. That's it. So long as you strafe, you can't be killed by anything during that phase, so it's purely how much DPS you have. This phase can't even be skipped. If you kill the boss, then the bar instantly fills and you have to enter the DPS mode. The only saving grace about this, and this is admittedly a detail I kinda like, is that when this phase activates, you get infinite ammo in your magazine and your abilities come off cooldown. The DPS phase is also all shields, so if you have fire or corrosive up until now, you're inherently at a disadvantage. But funnily enough, the fact that it shields is kind of a double-edged sword, because this is a scroll where crit damage bypasses shields, and there's also a weapon where if you hit an enemy with a charge shot, it'll instantly disable all their shields. And since he only has 1 HP, I can imagine this can go poorly for him. That is unless they manually disable those combos, which would be understandable, but I also think that'd kinda be a dick move. And that leads into another issue I have. Having only 2 weapons just feels off because enemies almost always have either shields or armor. When you play solo, you can only cover 2 health types unless you're using the Crown Prince. Armor reduces all non-corrosive damage by 25%, while other health types are at least neutral to non-elemental damage, so weapons-wise, it feels like it's best to just have a corrosive and normal weapon. Mix this in with the champions that appear after the normal difficulty, and some enemies just feel insanely tanky. I worked my way up to stage 2 of Reincarnation, which is the second of the 8 stages in the hardest difficulty mode, and I found myself getting bored at how tanky enemies were unless I found a god tier combo. That Aobai explosive build I talk about was on Reincarnation 1, and it was so strong that honestly it barely felt like I was on Reincarnation difficulty, except for when it threw a ton of champions at me, and I went from one-shotting enemies to slowly picking away at them, because not only was I dealing non-elemental damage, but some of them could double stack defensive modifiers for far more HP and reduced damage taken. Which is a shame, because Reincarnation adds some cool mechanics to help with your customization. Personally, I found Elite and Nightmare to be the most enjoyable difficulties to play on solos simply because you have more room to dick around, while still being decently challenging since enemies already do really high damage, and a really good build can still end up shitting all over the higher difficulties. But while that kinda sucks, overall this game just does so much well. There's so many little details that help, like being able to see when your weapon's spin up is about to reset, weapons dropping around the same level as your upgraded ones, so swapping weapons regularly isn't really penalized, and being able to drop almost every scroll in case you pick one up and later find that the benefit isn't worth the downside. And man, I gotta give them props for the art and animation. For how little texture detail the environments have, they look really nice, with the exception of the first area. The enemies as well all have really cool designs and animations, especially the ones in the third and fourth area. Probably the only thing in this game I'm not a fan of how it looks is Tao. I don't know why they decided to not only make her really short, but also made her really chunky and stacked like pancakes. The proportions are just so weird. The thing I'm most impressed with, however, is the weapons. Not only is every weapon different functionally, but almost every single one has its own unique reload animations. Even with the reload animations that are very similar, or even shared, there's enough going on with the weapon details itself that really sell the amount of effort they put into them. My two favorites are probably Hell and Justice. Justice being the 6-legged lizard that fires molten rocks. The reload is you just fucking smacking him to stop him from vomiting something up. Hell is a pump-action shotgun that is also a living demon. It's a shotgun that reloads one shot at a time, but you do it by throwing flaming fish snacks into the demon's gaping mouth. It's such an amazing and creative way to handle what is just a normal pump-action shotgun. So the only thing that's really left to mention is what you do after you beat a run, which I did touch on a bit. After your first run on normal, you unlock Elite, which gives access to more difficult rooms, as well as the champions, which have a variety of modifiers to them, with sometimes adding new mechanics to deal with. You can also see Elites in normal rooms on the rare occasion. This also grants access to more weapons and scrolls as they require Elite or higher difficulty to unlock. After that is Nightmare. This is more of the same really, it's just harder. Beating this grants you Reincarnation, which is the hardest difficulty that has 8 stages to it. This even adds more mechanics such as enhanced versions of all the scrolls that either buff the effects or remove the downsides, as well as some new modifiers to help improve your character, which can be accessed by a new NPC who can appear randomly or at the beginning of each stage. Past that, you have the daily challenge. This gives you a few perks to start, some starting weapons, and tasks you with beating only one stage, while dealing with some unique modifiers to make it more challenging. If there's one thing I wish I could have seen, it would probably be the multiplayer. I mentioned that it existed, but I never really got to touch it due to the fact that no one I know plays this game, and the matchmaking seems a little barren. So, that's Gunfire Reborn. Frankly, I fucking love it, and I can't wait to see what new updates are coming down the road, as well as any future games these guys are going to make, because they clearly have some talent.